It was a quiet evening in the small town of Ashford when 22-year-old Emily Carter was last seen. The streets were empty, the shops had closed, and only the dim glow of streetlights illuminated the sidewalks. Emily had been walking home from her part-time job at the local cafe. She had sent her last text to her best friend Lucy at 8:37 p.m. saying, "Almost home. Talk soon." But she never made it. When Emily's parents, Linda and Mark Carter, realized she hadn't returned by midnight, panic set in. They tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. At first, they thought she might have gone out with Lucy or another friend. But after multiple calls and messages went unanswered, they knew something was wrong. By 2 a.m., Mark Carter was knocking on the door of the Ashford Police Department, demanding help. Officer Daniel Reed, a dedicated policeman with 10 years on the force, was assigned to the case. He had grown up in Ashford, knew almost everyone in town, and had a reputation for being thorough. He immediately organized a search party. Volunteers, including Emily's friends and neighbors, joined the police in combing the streets, parks, and alleyways. They searched through the night and into the next morning, but there was no trace of Emily. By noon, Officer Reed was standing outside the cafe where Emily had worked, questioning her coworkers. "She left like usual," said Sarah, one of Emily's closest friends. "She was fine, happy even. She didn't mention any plans to meet anyone." Reed then checked the cafe's security footage. The video showed Emily leaving at 8:25 p.m., wearing her denim jacket, backpack slung over one shoulder. The footage also captured something unusual: a dark-colored sedan parked across the street with its headlights off. A man sat inside, his face obscured by the darkness. Reed felt a chill run down his spine. "Who owns this car?" he asked, showing a still image to his colleagues. No one recognized it. The case grew more puzzling as the hours passed. No witnesses came forward. No calls or messages were received from Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The town's residents grew restless. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Emily had run away, though her family insisted she would never do such a thing. Others whispered about the possibility of foul play. Reed refused to give up. He and his team expanded the search to nearby highways, abandoned buildings, and the thick forest bordering the town. Days passed, then a week. Still, no sign of Emily. Then something unexpected happened. One evening, as Officer Reed was finishing his shift, he stepped outside the station and noticed a stray dog sitting nearby. It was a skinny, golden-furred dog with alert eyes. The dog had been hanging around the station for days, and some officers had taken to feeding it scraps. Reed had always had a soft spot for dogs. He pulled out a sandwich from his bag, tore off a piece, and tossed it toward the dog. "Here you go, buddy," he said. The dog eagerly ate the food but didn't leave. Instead, it stared at Reed with an almost pleading expression. Reed found it odd. "What is it?" he murmured. The dog took a few steps away, turned back and barked. Then it trotted a little farther, pausing to look back at Reed. It was as if it wanted him to follow. Reed hesitated, then shrugged. "Why not?" He followed the dog as it led him through the streets, past the town's edge, and toward the dense forest. The deeper they went, the more uneasy Reed felt. The sun had begun to set, casting eerie shadows through the trees. After several minutes, the dog stopped near a clearing and began to whimper. It circled a patch of disturbed soil, pawing at the ground. Reed's breath caught. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it over the area. The ground had been recently disturbed, loose dirt scattered across the forest floor. His instincts screamed at him. He radioed for backup. Moments later, he grabbed a stick and carefully scraped away the top layer of dirt. Something pale appeared beneath. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. By the time the other officers arrived, Reed had uncovered a piece of fabric. Denim. He swallowed hard. It was the same material as the jacket Emily had been wearing the night she disappeared. He turned to his colleagues, his voice grim. "We need to start digging. Now." As the officers worked under the dim glow of their flashlights, the forest remained eerily silent. Each shovelful of dirt sent a wave of tension through Officer Reed's chest. He had been on the force long enough to know that hope was fading. "Careful," he said, his voice low but firm. The others nodded, their faces grim. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then one of the officers let out a sharp gasp. "Sir, I found something." Reed stepped closer and aimed his flashlight downward. His heart clenched. A pale hand protruded from the soil, fingers curled slightly, as if frozen mid-reach. The dirt around it was dark and damp. A heavy silence fell over the group. No one spoke as they continued digging, carefully uncovering the rest of the body. Soon, the unmistakable sight of long brown hair came into view, tangled and matted with dirt. Reed felt his stomach tighten. He didn't need confirmation. He knew. Emily Carter had been found. One of the officers, Officer Patel, removed his cap and let out a shaky breath. "God, she's been here a while." Reed turned away for a moment, his jaw clenched. He had held on to the hope that she was alive, but now that hope was shattered. "We need forensics here immediately," Reed ordered. "No one touches anything until the scene is secured." Patel nodded and radioed the department. The dog that had led Reed to the site whimpered softly, sitting a few feet away, ears flattened. It hadn't moved since they started digging, as if mourning. Reed crouched beside it, gently patting its head. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "You brought me here." The dog let out a soft whine, pressing its head into Reed's palm. Within an hour, the site was flooded with police officers, forensic experts, and the town's medical examiner. Crime scene tape was wrapped around the area, and every step was taken with precision. Dr. Helen Morris, the town's forensic pathologist, knelt beside Emily's remains. "She's been here at least a week," she said, adjusting her gloves. "There are signs of bruising on her wrists and neck." Reed's fists clenched. "Strangled?" Dr. Morris nodded grimly. "Possibly, but I'll confirm after the autopsy." A photographer moved around the site, capturing every angle. Officers searched the surrounding area for evidence. Shoe prints, tire tracks, anything. Patel approached Reed. "We should notify her family." Reed exhaled slowly. This was the part he hated the most, telling parents that their child wasn't coming home. "I'll do it," he said. By the time he arrived at the Carter residence, it was nearly midnight. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the otherwise dark street. Mark and Linda Carter answered the door, their faces filled with desperate hope. "Did you find her?" Mark asked immediately. Reed hesitated, then lowered his gaze. That was all it took. Linda let out a heart-wrenching sob, collapsing against the doorframe. Mark clenched his fists, his face crumbling. "I'm so sorry," Reed said softly. "We found her in the forest." Linda shook her head violently. No, she can't be. She was just here. She was coming home." Reed swallowed the lump in his throat. "We will find who did this, I promise you." Mark wrapped his arms around his wife, his shoulders shaking. "Who would do this to our daughter?" he choked out. "We're going to find out," Reed assured him. "We won't stop until we do." As he left the house, his mind was already racing through the evidence they had so far. A dark sedan near the cafe, a hidden burial site in the forest. No signs of robbery, no known enemies. Emily had been taken by someone who had planned this. Reed's jaw tightened. He wouldn't rest until her killer was behind bars. The sun had barely risen when Officer Reed arrived at the station. Sleep had been a luxury he couldn't afford. Emily Carter's face haunted him. The image of her lifeless body buried beneath the earth refused to leave his mind. The crime scene had yielded little evidence overnight. The soil was disturbed, but there were no obvious footprints or tire marks. Whoever had done this had been careful. Reed sighed, rubbing his temples as he sat at his desk. His coffee had gone cold, but he took a sip anyway. Across from him, Officer Patel scrolled through surveillance footage from the cafe where Emily was last seen. "We've got a few leads," Patel muttered. Witnesses mentioned a dark sedan parked near the cafe that night. No clear license plate, but the timestamp places it around the time Emily was leaving. Reed leaned forward. "Did she interact with anyone?" Patel clicked on another video. It showed Emily stepping out of the cafe, her phone in hand. She looked around as if searching for someone. A minute later, she walked toward the parking lot. The dark sedan's brake lights flickered on. "Did she get in?" Reed asked. Patel shook his head. "She walked past it, but look." He zoomed in, pointing to the driver's side window. A shadowy figure sat behind the wheel. They appeared to be watching her. Reed's gut twisted. "Can we enhance the image?" "I'll send it to tech," Patel said. Reed tapped his fingers on the desk. If the sedan belonged to the killer, then they had been watching Emily before she disappeared. This wasn't random. Just then, another officer entered the room. "Sir, Emily's autopsy report came in." Reed took the folder, his fingers tightening around it as he flipped it open. His pulse quickened as he scanned the findings. Time of death, approximately 10 to 12 hours after she was last seen. Cause of death, strangulation. Bruises on wrists and ankles suggested she had been restrained, but one detail stood out. A small amount of red fibers had been found on Emily's clothing. Reed frowned. "Red fibers? From what?" "Doctor, Morris thinks they might be from a vehicle interior," the officer said. "Carpet or upholstery, maybe." Reed's mind flashed to the dark sedan. "We need to find that car," he said. "Check traffic cams, parking lots, anything." Patel nodded and made the calls. Hours passed with no new breakthroughs. Frustration built in Reed's chest. He stepped outside for fresh air, running a hand through his hair. That was when he spotted the dog, the same one that had led him to Emily's grave. It sat near the station entrance, ears perked, tail still, watching him. Reed crouched. "Hey, girl, you following me now?" The dog whined, shifting on its paws. Then suddenly it turned and trotted away. Reed frowned. Something about its movements seemed intentional. On impulse, he followed. The dog led him down the street, past quiet houses, until it stopped in front of an older, single-story home with a sagging porch. It sat in eerie silence. Reed's instincts kicked in. He pulled out his phone and called Patel. "Send a unit to 146 Pine Street," he murmured. "I think I just found something." The dog let out a low growl. Reed's pulse quickened. There was something unsettling about the house. The closed curtains, the overgrown lawn. It looked abandoned, yet he could feel eyes watching him. Slowly, he stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath his boots. He tried the door. Locked. He knocked. "Police? Anyone home?" No response. The dog let out another low growl, its fur bristling. Reed moved to the side window and peered in. The house was dark, but he could make out a table, a few chairs, and something odd. A red jacket draped over one of them. His mind raced. Red fibers, a dark sedan, Emily's disappearance. Then a shadow shifted inside. Reed's instincts screamed at him. He stepped back, hand hovering over his holster. The dog barked sharply, the sound slicing through the silence. A floorboard creaked inside. Reed exhaled, gripping his radio. "Patel, get here now." Whoever was inside had just realized they weren't alone. Reed's heart pounded as he stepped off the porch, keeping his eyes on the house. The dog stayed beside him, ears pricked, muscles tensed. Something wasn't right. He lifted his radio. "Patel, what's your ETA?" 2 minutes, came the reply. 2 minutes. It felt like an eternity. Reed's hand hovered near his holster. He listened carefully, but the house remained eerily silent. No more movement inside. Whoever had been there knew he was outside. They were waiting. The dog let out a low, warning growl. Reed tensed. Then, a sharp noise from the back of the house. Someone was trying to leave. Reed sprinted around the side, drawing his weapon. He reached the backyard just in time to see a figure slipping through a gap in the fence. "Stop! Police!" Reed shouted. The figure hesitated for half a second, then bolted. Reed chased after them, heart hammering. The suspect was fast, weaving through the trees behind the house. Reed pushed himself harder, branches snapping underfoot. The dog darted ahead, closing the distance. Then the suspect made a fatal mistake, tripping over an exposed root. Reed lunged, grabbing the back of their hoodie and yanking them down. The person hit the ground hard, gasping. "Stay down," Reed ordered, pinning them. He forced their hands behind their backs, slapping the cuffs on. Patel arrived moments later, gun drawn. Got him? Yeah. Reed rolled the suspect onto their back. His stomach clenched. It was a young man, mid-20s, unshaven, eyes wild with fear. His hands were shaking. He reeked of sweat. Patel knelt beside him. Who are you? The man swallowed hard but said nothing. Reed pulled out his badge. We found Emily Carter's body. You know something? The man's face twitched. His breathing was ragged. He hesitated. I didn't kill her. Reed narrowed his eyes. Then who did? The man licked his lips, glancing at the dog still growling beside him. I saw something, okay? I was scared. I ran. Patel exchanged a look with Reed. Saw what? The man's eyes darted toward the house. Reed followed his gaze. Who else is inside? He asked. The man hesitated. Then in a whisper, he said, He's still in there. Reed's stomach dropped. Who? Patel demanded. The man swallowed. Tanner. The name sent a chill through Reed. Tanner Wyatt, a local mechanic. A man with a criminal record, drug possession, theft, a history of violence. But nothing that had ever stuck. Reed tightened his grip on the suspect's cuffs. You're saying Tanner killed Emily? The man nodded, eyes darting around. I didn't know, man. I didn't know he did that. I was staying with him, and then I saw the news and... Reed's blood ran cold. Tanner Wyatt had been under their noses the whole time, and he was still inside that house. Patel, call for backup, Reed ordered, standing. Patel immediately relayed the request. Reed turned to the dog. She was still staring at the house, tense, waiting. She had led him here. She knew. The air felt heavy. Then, a flicker of movement in the window. Reed's grip tightened on his gun. He's watching us. Patel exhaled sharply. What's the play? Reed's mind raced. They couldn't rush in without backup, but waiting might give Tanner time to escape. The dog suddenly barked, startling them both. Then, the front door creaked open. Reed's pulse spiked. A figure stepped out onto the porch. Tanner Wyatt. He looked calm. Too calm. His hands were in his pockets. His head tilted slightly, eyes scanning Reed and Patel like he was sizing them up. What's going on, officers? He asked smoothly. Reed kept his gun steady. Hands where we can see them, Tanner. Tanner didn't move. A smirk curled his lips. Now, he said. No need for that. Reed's gut twisted. Something was off. Then in a flash, Tanner bolted back inside. Damn it, Reed cursed, surging forward. Patel was right behind him. They reached the porch just as a loud crash echoed from inside. Tanner was trying to escape. Reed grabbed his radio. We need more units now. Suspect is fleeing through the back. Another loud bang from inside the house. Patel cursed. He's breaking something. Maybe a window. Reed didn't wait. He kicked the door open, gun raised. The moment he stepped inside, he saw shattered glass on the floor. A back door swung open, its hinges creaking. He's running, Patel yelled. The dog bolted ahead, a blur of movement as she raced toward the open door. Reed ran after her, heart pounding. Tanner had a head start, but the dog was faster. She would catch him. And this time, he wouldn't escape. Reed sprinted through the open door, Patel close behind. The backyard was a mess. Overgrown grass, broken furniture, an old rusted truck with its hood open. Tanner was already halfway across the yard, vaulting over a wooden fence. The dog was faster. She shot past Reed like a bullet, her paws kicking up dirt as she lunged toward the fleeing suspect. Stop! Reed bellowed, raising his gun. Tanner didn't listen. He scrambled over the fence, hitting the ground running. The dog leaped after him, clearing the obstacle with ease. Reed cursed under his breath. Go left, he shouted to Patel. Cut him off. Patel veered off to the side, angling around the property. Reed clambered over the fence, his muscles screaming from the exertion. He landed hard, barely keeping his balance. Tanner was heading for the woods. Not this time. Reed pushed himself harder, his boots slamming against the dirt. The dog was closing in, growling as she snapped at Tanner's heels. Just before she reached him, Tanner twisted, kicking out hard. His boot connected with the dog's side. She yelped and tumbled into the dirt. Reed's vision went red. "Enough!" he roared, raising his weapon. Tanner hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The dog recovered instantly, launching herself at him. This time, her teeth found their mark. Tanner screamed as she latched onto his arm, dragging him to the ground. He thrashed, trying to shake her off, but she held firm. Reed closed the distance in seconds, pinning Tanner's back to the dirt. "Stay down," he barked. Patel arrived, breathless, gun aimed. Tanner's chest heaved. Blood dripped from his arm where the dog had bitten him. "Call her off," he panted, eyes wide with terror. Reed glanced at the dog. "Let go," he ordered. She hesitated, growling deep in her throat, then released Tanner's arm. Reed snapped the cuffs onto Tanner's wrists. "Tanner Wyatt, you're under arrest." "For what?" Tanner sneered. "You got nothing on me." Reed leaned in close. "We found Emily Carter." Tanner flinched. Patel yanked him to his feet. "You want to talk now?" Tanner scowled. "I want a lawyer." Reed's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Fine, you'll get one, but you're not walking away from this." They dragged Tanner back to the house, where more officers were waiting. The dog trotted beside them, her tail high. Reed looked down at her and nodded. Good girl. She had led them to Emily. She had led them to Tanner. And now the real fight for justice would begin. The officers placed Tanner into the back of a squad car, but Reed wasn't done. He turned to Patel. "We need to search his house. If he did this, there will be evidence." Patel nodded. "We'll get a warrant." Reed watched as the dog sat beside him, her ears perked. She had never stopped watching Tanner, as if she knew he was still dangerous. A few minutes later, backup arrived. Officers swarmed the house, securing the perimeter. Patel stepped away to coordinate with the team, while Reed knelt beside the dog. He scratched behind her ears. "You're incredible. You know that?" The dog licked his hand in response. One of the officers called out, "Detective!" "We found something inside." Reed stood, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" The officer led him inside. In the dim light, the house felt even more sinister than before. The air smelled musty, like sweat and something worse, something rotting. Then he saw it, a blood-stained shirt crumpled in the corner of the living room. Emily's shirt. Reed exhaled sharply. It was the break they needed. Tanner wasn't just guilty. They could prove it. But there was something else. Near the couch, a loose floorboard was slightly raised. Reed's gut tightened as he knelt and pried it open. Inside, a small wooden box rested in the hidden compartment. He lifted the lid. Photographs, dozens of them. Emily wasn't the only victim. Reed's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about Emily Carter anymore. They had a serial predator on their hands. Reed stared at the photographs, his stomach twisting. The images were old, some faded, but each one showed a young woman. Different faces, different places, all of them looking afraid. He flipped through them with shaking hands. Patel leaned over his shoulder, his face grim. "How many are there?" Reed swallowed. "Too many." Patel exhaled sharply, pulling out his radio. "We need forensics in here, now." Another officer stepped forward, gloves already on. "Bag them." Reed placed the photos in an evidence bag, his mind racing. Tanner hadn't just killed Emily. He'd done this before. The wooden box had more than photos. A few locks of hair, carefully tied with ribbons, small trinkets, rings, necklaces, bracelets, trophies. Reed's jaw clenched. Patel cursed under his breath. "This guy's a damn monster." Reed turned to the officer beside him. "We need every inch of this house searched. If there are more bodies, we'll find them." The officer nodded and hurried off. Tanner sat outside in the squad car, his face impassive. But Reed knew. He knew the moment Tanner had flinched at Emily's name. Now he had proof. Reed walked outside, standing just beyond the car's open door. "You still want that lawyer?" Tanner smirked, but there was something nervous in his eyes. "I know my rights." Reed studied him for a long moment. "Yeah? Let me tell you what we found inside. He let the words hang between them before continuing. Photos. Lots of them. Not just Emily. Tanner's smirk faltered. Reed leaned closer. We found your little box of secrets. All those girls. Their things. Their hair. Tanner's expression darkened. Reed felt his pulse quicken. You killed Emily, and I bet she wasn't the first, but she's gonna be the last. Tanner's jaw clenched. I'm not saying a damn thing. Reed straightened, looking at Patel. Get him to the station. Patel nodded, slamming the car door shut. Reed turned back to the house. More officers were inside now, dusting for prints, collecting samples. The dog sat beside the doorway, ears perked. Reed knelt beside her, scratching behind her ears. We wouldn't be here without you. She licked his hand. Another officer emerged from the house. Detective, you need to see this. Reed followed him inside. They led him to the basement door. It was locked, a heavy chain across it. Break it, Reed ordered. The officer grabbed a crowbar, wedging it beneath the chain. With a grunt, he pried it free. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase. Reed turned on his flashlight, stepping inside. The basement smelled damp. Something metallic lingered in the air. As the light swept across the room, Reed's stomach dropped. A chair sat in the center, restraints bolted to its arms. The walls were lined with hooks, old stains marking the concrete floor. Patel cursed. Jesus! Reed's throat felt dry. Get forensics down here, now! More officers hurried down, cameras flashing as they documented the scene. Reed ran a hand over his face. Emily had suffered here. Others too. And now Tanner was going away for a long, long time. But there was still one thing left. Reed turned to the dog, who sat patiently at the basement door. What do you think, girl? You ready to finish this? She wagged her tail. For a long moment, Reed just stood there, taking it all in. The weight of the case pressed against him like a physical force. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It never had been. Patel's voice broke the silence. We're going to need a bigger team. If he's been doing this for years, who knows how many victims there are? Reed nodded. We start digging, literally if we have to. The dog let out a small bark, as if urging them forward. Reed gave her one last pat. Come on then, let's get to work. The forensic team moved methodically, combing through every inch of the basement. The walls bore scratches, some deep, some shallow. Signs of struggle, evidence of suffering. One of the officers crouched, running a gloved hand along the floor. Detective, we might have something here. Reed stepped closer, shining his flashlight where the officer pointed. A section of the concrete appeared different, newer, smoother. His heart pounded. Get the ground-penetrating radar, he ordered. Minutes later, the device was set up, scanning the floor. The readout was clear. Something was buried beneath. Reed clenched his fists. We need a warrant to dig. Patel was already on the phone. I'm on it. Reed turned to the officers. We'll stay here all night if we have to. This ends now. Tanner wasn't just a killer, he was a predator, and Reed was going to make damn sure he never saw the light of day again. The dog, still sitting by his side, let out a low growl. She knew, just as Reed did, that the horrors buried in this place were finally coming to light, and neither of them would stop until justice was served. The tension inside the house was thick as officers moved through every room, cataloging evidence. Reed stood near the basement entrance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His mind raced, replaying every detail of the case. Emily had led them here, even in death, and now justice was within reach. Patel returned from the front door, his phone still in hand. Warrants approved. We can start digging. Reed nodded sharply. Let's get to it. Officers set to work, carefully chipping away at the newly laid concrete in the basement. The forensic team worked with precision, knowing that whatever they uncovered could be the key to putting Tanner away forever. The dog sat at the edge of the basement stairs, watching intently. It was as if she understood the weight of the moment. Minutes stretched into hours. The air was thick with dust as the officers methodically removed the top layer of cement. And then, a dull thud. Reed's stomach twisted. He stepped forward, shining his flashlight into the small opening the team had uncovered. "Careful," Patel murmured. One of the forensic experts knelt down, using gloved hands to brush away loose debris. The outline of something wooden came into view. "A box," one of the officers muttered. Reed's pulse pounded as the team pried it open. Inside were more trophies. Rings, bracelets, small items that once belonged to someone who would never see them again. But there was more. Beneath the box, the ground was uneven, softer. One of the officers turned to Reed. "We're going to need shovels." The room fell silent as digging resumed. Each scoop of dirt revealed more. A shoe, fragments of fabric. Then, the unmistakable shape of human remains. Patel exhaled sharply. "Jesus!" Reed swallowed the lump in his throat. "Mark everything. We need IDs on every victim." One of the forensic analysts was already snapping photos. "This is big," she murmured. "Really big." Reed's jaw tightened. This wasn't just Emily's grave. It was a burial site, a dumping ground for Tanner's victims. The realization sent a chill down his spine. "How many?" The analyst shook her head. "We won't know until we finish, but it's not just one." The weight of it all pressed down on Reed. Tanner had been doing this for years, hiding in plain sight, and no one had stopped him until now. The dog let out a soft whine, nudging Reed's hand. He absently scratched her behind the ears. Patel turned to him. "What now?" Reed took a deep breath. "Now we make damn sure he never walks free again." Outside, Tanner sat in the squad car, his expression unreadable. But Reed saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against his knee. He was nervous. "Good." Reed walked up to the car and leaned in. "We found them," he said simply. Tanner's fingers stopped tapping. Reed studied his face. "How many, Tanner?" "How many did you kill?" No answer. Reed's voice hardened. "You can keep your mouth shut, but it won't save you. We have enough to bury you under the prison." Tanner turned to face him, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a smirk. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Reed held his gaze. "I know enough." Patel approached. "They found more." Reed straightened. "How many?" Patel's face was grim. "At least 3, maybe more." Reed turned back to Tanner. "This is over." Tanner leaned back against the seat, his expression unreadable again. "We'll see." Reed slammed the door shut. "Yeah, we will." Back inside, the excavation continued. Every new discovery added to the weight on Reed's shoulders. Every bone, every fragment of clothing was another life taken too soon. The forensic team worked tirelessly, logging every detail. The depth of the burial site suggested years of horror. Some remains were older, bones nearly disintegrating under careful touch. Others were disturbingly fresh. Patel ran a hand through his hair. How did no one notice? How did he get away with this for so long? Reed clenched his jaw. Because monsters like him know how to hide. And no one was looking, until now. One of the forensic analysts approached with a solemn expression. "We found something else." Reed followed her to the edge of the dig site. She pointed to a small metal box, partially buried. Carefully, she pried it open. Inside were Polaroids. Reed swallowed hard as he flipped through them. Each was a picture of a different girl, some smiling, others looking terrified. The dates on the back spanned over a decade. Reed's grip tightened. This was more than evidence. This was a record of a predator's work. Proof that Emily wasn't just a random victim, she was part of a pattern. Patel met his eyes. "We bring in the families, we get identifications, and then we make sure Tanner never breathes free air again." Reed nodded. "This ends now." The police station was buzzing with activity. The discovery at Tanner's house had shaken the entire department. Officers moved in and out, discussing evidence, logging statements, and preparing for what would undoubtedly be a high-profile case. Reed sat at his desk, reviewing the crime scene photos. Each image was a grim reminder of how much had been hidden beneath the surface. The unearthed remains, the small personal items, the Polaroids. It was overwhelming. Yet the work was far from over. Patel walked in, dropping a thick file onto the desk. Coroner's report came in for Emily. Time of death confirmed she was killed the night she disappeared. Reed exhaled slowly. And the others? They're still working through it, but initial findings suggest some of the victims date back almost 15 years. Reed clenched his jaw. 15 years of hunting in the shadows. He shook his head. How the hell did he get away with this for so long? Patel sighed. Small town, limited resources. He knew how to pick his victims. No one ever connected the dots. Reed ran a hand through his hair. Until now. Patel nodded. Until now. Just then, an officer walked up. Detectives, Tanner's lawyer is here. Reed and Patel exchanged looks. Let's hear what he has to say, Reed said, pushing back from his desk. They entered the interrogation room, where Tanner sat, handcuffed to the table. Across from him was a sharply dressed man with a briefcase, his expression unreadable. The lawyer spoke first. My client will not be answering any questions. Reed smirked. That's so. He tossed a folder onto the table, letting the crime scene photos spill out. Take a good look, Tanner. We have enough evidence to keep you locked up for the rest of your life. Tanner remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. Patel leaned in. You think a lawyer's gonna save you? We found the bodies. We found the photos. We found everything. The lawyer cleared his throat. Unless you have a direct confession, I suggest you stop wasting our time. Reed narrowed his eyes. We don't need a confession. We already have more than enough. Tanner finally looked up, a slow smirk curling on his lips. You think you know me? His voice was low, taunting. You think you know what I've done? Reed didn't flinch. I know enough, and soon the whole world will know too. Tanner leaned back in his chair, his smirk never fading. Then I guess I'll see you in court. Reed's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. Enjoy your cell, Tanner. You won't be leaving it again. With that, Reed and Patel walked out, the door slamming shut behind them. Outside the room, Patel exhaled sharply. He's playing games. Reed nodded. And we're going to make sure he loses. The work continued late into the night. Forensic teams combed through every detail, connecting evidence to missing persons cases. Calls were made to families who had spent years without answers. And through it all, Emily's dog remained at Reed's side, a silent reminder of why they were doing this. By morning, arrest warrants were being prepared for additional charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Tanner would never walk free again. As Reed looked over the growing case file, he felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Justice was finally being served. But deep down, he knew this case had changed him forever. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing as Tanner was led inside, shackled and silent. The town had never seen a case of this magnitude before, and the trial was set to be one of the most followed in years. Reed adjusted his tie as he entered the courtroom. Patel was already inside, reviewing notes with the prosecution. The weight of the case sat heavy on them both. Tanner's defense attorney took his place, his face unreadable. The prosecution had built a solid case. There was no denying the overwhelming evidence. Yet Tanner had refused to confess, and without a direct admission, the trial could still be long and grueling. The judge entered, and the courtroom hushed. The trial was officially underway. The prosecution began their case by laying out the forensic evidence. Photos of the burial site, the recovered belongings, and the gruesome remains were displayed for the jury. The lead forensic examiner took the stand, describing in detail how Emily and the other victims were found. Reed watched Tanner closely. The man sat still, no emotion crossing his face. It was as if none of this concerned him. Next, Emily's parents were called to the stand. Her mother, eyes red and puffy, clutched a tissue as she described the last time she saw her daughter. She was supposed to come home that night, she whispered. She never did. Her father sat rigid beside her, jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. The courtroom remained silent, heavy with grief. Then came the testimony that Reed had been waiting for, his own. Taking the stand, he recounted the night he followed the dog into the woods, the discovery of Emily's body, the way the evidence led them to Tanner's home. The defense attorney was quick to pounce. "Detective Reed, isn't it true that your discovery was purely accidental? That if not for this stray dog, you never would have found the remains?" Reed didn't hesitate. "Accidental or not, the evidence speaks for itself. The victims were buried where Tanner lived. We found their belongings in his home. His DNA was there. This isn't coincidence," the lawyer paced. "And yet my client maintains his innocence." Reed leaned forward slightly. "Innocent men don't hide bodies." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge called for order. The trial stretched for days, each new piece of evidence painting a clearer picture of Tanner's crimes. But through it all, Tanner never wavered. He never spoke, never showed a hint of remorse. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the forensic analysts took the stand with a final piece of evidence. Tanner's old journals recovered from a locked drawer in his house. The prosecution carefully flipped through the pages, reading aloud disturbing entries that described the thrill of hunting his victims, the satisfaction of watching the town remain oblivious. A chilling silence fell over the courtroom. For the first time, Tanner's smirk faltered. Reed watched as the reality of the situation sank in. Tanner had been careful, meticulous, but he had left behind his own words, the undeniable proof of his guilt. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was read aloud. Guilty. A collective breath of relief swept through the room. Reed exhaled, his grip on the bench loosening. It was over. Tanner was led away, his expression blank, his fate sealed. Outside the courthouse, Emily's parents wept, holding each other. Other families of the victims clutched onto one another, finally given the justice they had waited so long for. As Reed stepped outside, Emily's dog was there, sitting by the steps as if waiting for him. Kneeling down, he scratched behind her ears. "You did good, girl." The dog leaned into him, her tail wagging slightly. For the first time in weeks, Reed allowed himself a small smile. Justice had been served. The trial was over. Tanner was sentenced to life without parole, his past horrors now a permanent mark in the town's history. The courthouse steps were still filled with reporters, broadcasting the verdict across the nation. For many, it was justice long overdue. Reed stood near his car, watching as Emily's parents embraced. Their relief was evident, though the pain of loss would never fully fade. They had their closure, but no verdict could ever bring their daughter back. Patel walked up beside him. "Hell of a case, huh?" Reed nodded. "One of the hardest." They stood in silence for a moment before Patel added, "You did good, Reed. Without you and that dog, who knows how long this would have gone on." Reed glanced toward the steps where Emily's dog sat patiently, her golden fur shining in the afternoon light. She had never left his side throughout the investigation, almost as if she knew she had a mission to complete. "What's going to happen to her?" Patel asked. Reed had already made his decision. He crouched down, scratching the dog's head. "She's coming home with me." The dog's tail thumped against the ground. Patel smirked. "Guess you've got a new partner." Reed chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I do." The weeks that followed were quieter. The town slowly returned to normal, though the scars left by Tanner's crimes would never fully heal. The victims' families worked to create a memorial, a place where their loved ones could be remembered properly. Reed visited often. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about all the lives that had been stolen. Every time he stood there, he was reminded of why he had become a cop in the first place. At home, the dog had settled in well. He named her Luna, a nod to the moonlight that had guided them that fateful night in the woods. She had gone from a stray to a hero, and now she was family. One evening, as Reed sat on his porch, Luna curled up at his feet. He let out a deep breath. The case had changed him. It had tested his limits, challenged his beliefs, and left an imprint on his soul. But through it all, justice had been served. He looked down at Luna, giving her a gentle pat. "We did good, girl." She wagged her tail, her warm brown eyes full of understanding. For the first time in a long while, Reed felt at peace. And as the sun set over the quiet town, he knew, no matter what the future held, he and Luna would face it together. The end.